Welcome everybody to our webinar on veterans preferences and fair housing. Very important topic. Veterans served our country so well, and you would think they would receive high regard when it comes to housing, but that's not always been the case. So the first question is this: is military veteran status protected class category under fair housing laws, or are there any laws generally that protect veterans and housing? And the next part, can landlords and property owners in private housing or public housing agencies and other public housing or public assistance programs give preference to the applications and the occupancy of veterans or homeless veterans? And then are there examples of policies or best practices that can be used to reach veterans? Here's what we're going to look at. We're going to kind of get an introduction, show a couple videos. They're real short, barely a minute each, programs that have been designed in housing to reach veterans. And then we're going to look at veterans as a protected class and other protections that are available to veterans. And then we're going to look at veterans' preferences in fair housing, if there can be challenges to veterans' preference policies. And then we're going to look at some sample policies and answer a couple commonly asked questions. We thank and appreciate MSHA for funding this webinar and other webinars that we've been able to offer. So first off, we're going to look at a couple of short videos, barely 2 minutes each, if they are that, to look at what is being done in other places when it comes to veterans and their housing needs.
A new senior housing project is under construction in Logan County.
It's less than a year from opening, and as Anna Saunders explains, it will be the first of its kind in the state.
That's right. What you see behind me will soon be some of the 33 units that will be here in the Loganwood apartment complex, senior housing that will be especially catered to veterans. Roger Ramey, the chairman of the Logan County Housing Authority and an Air Force veteran himself, for the first time stands inside what's been a years-long project.
It's so important, it's unbelievable. And to see it actually be standing here in the building right now talking to you is just, it's amazing.
After building a senior housing development across town, Ramey said they quickly realized the area needed more, but this time they wanted it to have a specialty.
We were approached by Scotty Beckett, the fire chief of the city of Logan, about a veterans project. So we started checking into stuff and we actually tried to apply for some funding for a veterans project. And we found out that through a quasi-government agency, the Housing Authority, that we didn't qualify for certain funds.
So they formed a nonprofit calling it the Logan Housing Corporation, and then were able to secure the $9 million in funding for the Loganwood apartments. It will be a 4-floor facility with 33 units. Seniors 60 and older will be able to apply, with veterans getting first preference.
Every person that moved in here may not be a veteran, but the first ones in will be veterans. And at any time, whenever there's an opening, if there's a veteran on the waiting list, they'll be the next person to go in.
Ramey says he's already getting interest in the facility, and not just from possible tenants, but other people around the country wanting to build the same.
Even in the northern part of the state, some people are, well, how's Logan County getting this done? Well, we put a team together that's working.
Now, the goal is to have this facility up and running by May of next year.
We all know the cost of living is high on the Central Coast, and KSBY News is working with you to help navigate that challenge. In this Prize of Paradise segment, we take a closer look at how one local organization is helping veterans keep a roof over their heads. A new development in Templeton is underway, creating 36 units of affordable housing, 10 of which will be set aside for unhoused veterans. People's Self-Help Housing is trying to address the high demand in SLO County, with over 100 people with low income on a wait list for their affordable units. Helping veterans is a top priority, not only with housing, but also with work, many on site taking part in the construction.
In this county, there are over 17,000 households that are veterans or active military. And in the last count of homeless population in our county, it was from a couple years ago, there was over 140 veterans in that group, and they were almost all unsheltered. And so we've got a big demand, and we owe our veterans, that.
The organization has applied for additional funding from the state to launch similar projects. Currently, there are 2 other developments underway in Atascadero and in San Luis Obispo. Applications for the Templeton complex are currently being accepted. You can find a link and more details a little later in the morning on our website at ksby.com.
Programs, they weren't excluding people who were not veterans. On the first one, initially, they're going to allow occupancy to people who are veterans, and then others can certainly live there as well. Non-veterans can live there. But if there's a veteran that applies, it will be given preference to the next available unit. And on the second housing development, the new construction, they set aside a certain number of units to serve veterans. So we're going to come back to that. And that's real important, the way that they handle that. And that's important when it comes to fair housing compliance. So the question is are veterans a protected class under the fair housing law? And before we look at that, what are the statistics on veterans? Do they need protection? You know, what characteristics, demographics do we see with veterans? The Census Bureau does a housing, part of it is housing. They do a community survey on housing. And here's what they put. Who are Americans veterans? Throughout history, they have included the Green Mountain Boys, Buffalo Soldiers, Tuskegee Airmen, women Air Force service pilots, Screaming Eagles, and Green Berets. They are the men and women who served their country, home and abroad, land and sea and air, and since 1973 have served as an all-volunteer force. As a percentage of the population, about 18 million Americans are veterans as of 2018. And about 7% of the population. It's actually declined. There's been less people serving in the military and less veterans coming out of service. So it was 26.4 million in 2020. It's down to 18 million as of 2018. But that fluctuates over the years. It may increase. I would hope not with wars and things, but it may increase. But still, a significant percentage of our population are veterans. What are the data here? Believe it or not, very high. 43% of post 9/11 veterans have a service-related disability. That's very high. The newer type veterans or ones that served post 9/11 have a higher rate of disability in comparison to veterans from other periods. And the reports of it, you see people from IUDs and other kinds of situations that have sustained severe head trauma, head injuries, and so forth. But yes, very, very high. When you think of a veteran, think of someone with a higher percentage of having a disability. And here's kind of showing the example, and you can see the uptick. You would think my perception would be World War II, Korean War, brutal wars, the disabilities would be very, very significant. But look at this, post 9/11, it's even higher. Well, I would say military devices have gotten more deadly, devastating to veterans. And here are the characteristics of veterans, the demographic characteristics. If you look at all veterans, post 9/11, Gulf War, and peacetime post Vietnam era, I'll take those. White population 71.9%, black is up to 17.1%, Hispanic 6.7%. So you can see the percentage of minorities have increased. It's not a predominantly white veteran group as maybe it was previously. It used to be higher in the even 80% range. Now it's much lower. So a policy that's favoring veterans, whatever, will benefit minority populations. Another one, big trend, this probably is obvious, right? The population of veterans that are women between 1980 and 2018 increased more than double, from 4% to 9%. Estimates are by 2040, the percentage of female veterans will increase to about 18%. That's just an estimate, could even be higher. But here's an interesting one. Compared to the broader population of women who have never served, female veterans who have served are more likely to have a college degree, work full-time, have work year-round, and have higher earnings when working full-time. So women in combat, women in service have done quite well. Here's one where it looks at the percentage, another data showing the percentage of women who have served. And you can see it. We used to be quite low, and the kind of services that women provided were probably more clerical, secretarial type things. Now it's a little bit more involved in all the various service types or opportunities within the armed services. And you can see post 9/11 up to 16.8% already. Fairly high, fairly high. So again, veterans preference is going to perhaps benefit a higher percentage of women than was the case previously. And homelessness, right? Homelessness, our veterans More likely to experience homelessness? Yes, 22 out of every 10,000 veterans experience homelessness. That's higher than the general population, which is just 20 out of every 10,000. And the total numbers are high. 35,574 veterans experience homelessness, and that's approximately 7% of all adults experiencing homelessness. There is good news. I didn't put it in here, but the number of veterans who are homeless actually decreased from 2011, 2012 to 2021, 2022 to 2023. Let's see how that goes. I hope, that trend continues. I'm not so sure with the high price of housing these days. Here's some more data on veterans experiencing homelessness. You can see women 14%, or gender female 80, sheltered veterans. You can see male 84%, female 14%. So this is still significant. Does impact males or male veterans, but there's a significant percentage of now females who are veterans who are experiencing homelessness. Hispanic, Latino is up to 18.4%. That's pretty significant as well. It has various information on race and ethnicity. Black population, veterans, 25% of the homeless veteran population. That's pretty significant. White population is 57%. Going over these statistics, it's gonna make a difference when we get into some of the fair housing challenges, or to address some of the fair housing challenges that come to veterans policies. So are veterans a protected class under federal law? Not when it comes to housing. Veterans are not listed as a protected class under the Federal Fair Housing Act. There have been bills introduced into Congress for such coverage, but they've not been enacted. One bill, 2022, Senator Tim Kaine, he was actually a longtime fair housing attorney. He introduced the Fair Housing Improvement Act of 2022, which would have had veteran status, military status, and source of income as protected class categories. There was not movement in the Senate on that. And you can see how the bill defined military status and veteran status as well. Status of persons as what? Currently in service or former member of the armed services. So while there's no federal protection, it'd be a mistake to think that veterans do not have any federal protection. There are a number of laws, particularly the laws that deal with discrimination or rights to reasonable accommodation modifications under federal laws. The primary ones are the Fair Housing Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. That involves programs, federally funded, financed programs, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So those provide some protections to veterans who have disabilities. And again, as I mentioned, they not only prohibit discrimination against persons with disabilities, which would include veterans, but also give veterans and other persons with disabilities the right to have reasonable accommodations and modifications as to their housing. But there are other federal protections available to veterans. Most of these have to do with employment. The EEOC summarized these laws in a guide. It's a 2020 policy, a guide to employers, entitled Veterans and the Americans with Disabilities Act, a guide for employers. But beyond mentioning the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, the EEOC guidance highlights other laws: the Veterans Preference Act of 1944, Uniform Service Employment and Reemployment Act, Rights Act of 1994, and the Vietnam Era Veterans Right Readjustment Assistance Act. So that's really important to look at those. Most of those, again, they have to do with the rights of veterans in employment, that they can be given preferences in employment. I'm hard pressed to see how veterans can get a preference in employment, but not get the same kind of protection when it comes to housing. That's kind of disappointing, but Congress just has not acted when it comes to housing. There's going to be good news. Most of what follows here will be good news. States. Do states include veterans as a protected class and protect them from adverse treatment and discrimination? There's a couple listed here. Most states do not. I just went to the larger states. Massachusetts gives a lot of civil rights protection, but they prohibit discrimination because such person is a veteran or member of the armed forces. California covers military and veteran status, including being a member or veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, the Reserve, National Guard, California National Guard, or even being perceived as someone that has been in the military. And New York protects those with membership in the reserve armed forces of the U.S. or an organized militia of the state. So they give various definitions, but they do provide protection for veterans in housing. Why is this necessary? Because I'm mentioning about how 43% of veterans now come out with some type of a disability. That is an outrageously high percentage that needs to be addressed. Housing providers look at that and say, well, we don't want to rent to someone like that. Who knows what they'll do? They may go ballistic, right? All these kind of prejudices and stereotypes against persons with disabilities impacts veterans. They do need protection. Actually, we're in Michigan, I want to say 2018 or maybe 2019, there was a bill introduced in the Michigan legislature to add military status as a protected class. Again, there was no movement on that. So this really needs to be done, long overdue. And I don't think there would be any, I think it should have bipartisan support. Like, are there fair housing issues associated with veterans' preferences? Are they subject to challenge under the fair housing laws? Well, there's two main theories of liability in fair housing cases. There's disparate treatment. This is the most commonly alleged. It requires direct or circumstantial evidence of discriminatory intent against one or more members of a protected class. If an intent is shown by comparing the treatment of protected class members with people outside that protected class. Disparate impact is less often alleged. That involves a facially neutral policy, which in application or when it's applied, disproportionately adversely impacts a protected group. Typically, it's done through statistics, and there's no requirement in disparate impact to prove discriminatory intent. So look at disparate treatment. Can't bring it directly. Well, I'm not going to rent to you. You're a veteran. Well, because veterans are not listed as a protected class. And if I flip it around, if there is a veteran preference policy, well, who is that impacting? Does that mean denying residency or occupancy or the application of someone who's a non-veteran? Non-veterans are not a protected class. So there is no claim for direct evidence when it comes to a veteran's preference policy. Well, the question is, can there be shown through indirect circumstantial evidence that a veterans or homeless veterans policy is disfavoring a protected group? Typically, it's not going to be raised. First of all, policy favoring veteran status is a facially neutral classification. The only way that can be shown is if the policy, a veteran's preference, homeless veterans preference policy, was adopted with a discriminatory purpose or motivation. Just not a lot of cases on this. The best I could come up with was Supreme Court decision, Personnel Administration of Massachusetts versus Feeney. It's a 1979 case. It goes back a number of years. And the Supreme Court rejected an equal protection clause. Equal protection clause protects against sex discrimination and race, color. But here was they were using it for sex discrimination. There was a Massachusetts law that provided a lifetime preference to veterans for civil service positions. The court, looking at it, said the definition of veterans is gender neutral. And the state always defined veteran status in a way that was gender neutral. And the court noted that a significant number of non-veterans were men. That was back in 1979. Case probably went its way through the court system pre-1979. Look at the difference today. A significant number of non-veterans were men. Now it's even less. I would flip it around. A growing significant percentage of veterans are women. Again, according to the court, the record failed to establish that this preference for veterans was originally devised or subsequently reenacted because it would accomplish collateral goal of keeping women in stereotypic and predefined place in the Massachusetts civil service. So I think that's really telling. The only way to really get a disparate treatment case against a housing provider for a veterans preference policy or homeless veterans preference policy is to show that it was specifically adopted to exclude persons of a particular race or sex and so forth. I just think that's really just a stretch, because any type of policy with the growing percentage of minorities and women in the armed services, in military service, it becomes very, very less likely for that type of a showing or that type of intent to occur. The other theory is disparate impact. There's a three-step approach, always a three-step approach in disparate impact. First one, step one requires proof that a specific policy that's facially neutral. A veteran's preference policy is facially neutral, but proof that it has significant adverse and disproportionate effect or creates, increases, or perpetuates segregated housing patterns. Typically, that's done through statistical evidence. Challenge would likely be based on allegation of sex discrimination, as majority of veterans are male. However, it's unlikely to establish statistical disparity, as most housing providers accept veterans or homeless veterans only as a portion of their housing units. The videos show that. In the first one, they gave preference to veterans, but certainly would rent to non-veterans. And on the second one, they set aside only a certain number of units for veterans, and the other units were available to non-veterans. And so that really hurts the statistical showing. It makes it very, very difficult to establish the statistical showing. But let's assume step one is met, that there's an adverse statistical impact by a veteran's preference or homeless veterans policy. This is very dubious. I don't think it survives even on that first step. Then the housing provider would need to show that the challenged veterans preference policy is necessary to achieve one or more. These are substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interests, and not simply creating an artificial, arbitrary, or unnecessary barrier. And so it's likely to achieve it when we look at the needs of the veterans when it comes to homelessness, increased need to prevent homelessness, addressed because of disabilities and so forth. I think that it certainly satisfies it. If there was any doubt, which I don't think there is, you can always turn to the HUD policies. HUD has a number of policies to help homeless persons and veterans. First, HUD's Home Investment Partnership Program establishes a preference for individuals with special needs, homeless persons, elderly persons, or persons with disabilities. While the preferences cannot be granted in a fashion that would violate any non-discrimination requirements, there is no fair housing prohibition against offering a veteran's preference. So they're allowed to do it. A program that's helping homeless persons will obviously impact and benefit veterans. HUD's Public Housing Occupancy Handbook says that for veterans' preference, public housing agencies may adopt a preference for veterans. And they just caution that they have to make sure that charged from service other than for a dishonorable reason. And the ranking, you can give ranking and you can have a veteran preference assigning 3 points for a veterans. So that's right under HUD's Public Housing Occupancy Handbook, which shows the federal interest in a veterans preference policy. HUD also has a guidance, Public Housing Guidance 2013-15, under guidance on housing individual families experiencing homelessness through the public housing and housing choice voucher programs, and has the waiting list, if you look there, that they can give non-discriminatory preference for chronically homeless and homeless veterans. And again, provided that there's not discrimination on any other basis, that policy, those type of policies not only can be adopted, HUD recommends them. So that gives preference to veterans on waiting lists for public housing and under the housing HCV or Section 8 program. Third step would be, assuming step 2 is met, that there's non-discriminatory reasons for the adoption of the policy. The challenger of the veterans preference policy must show the provider's interest could be served by an alternative practice that has less of a discriminatory effect. This is probably too difficult to meet because we mentioned earlier the demographic characteristics of veterans and homeless veterans support the preference. And I'm not sure if there is a policy that will meet the needs of veterans and homeless veterans as a veterans preference policy. I can't imagine an alternative practice that would meet that needs. And as I mentioned before, veterans have a higher incidence of disability and homelessness in comparison to the overall population. And these considerations apply with full force to female veterans, minority veterans, as they increase as percentage of the veteran population. They also will benefit from veterans preference programs. So what are some sample veterans preference policies? There are a couple. Many are available online. I looked at the Boston Housing Authority as a policy, admissions and continued occupancy policy for Boston Housing Authority public housing programs, and the New York State has affirmative fair housing marketing guide for managing agents, owners, and developers. So Boston Housing Authority, BHA, gives preferences to applicants who are veterans, Boston residents, and so forth. So it's right there to veterans. It's not restricted to homeless veterans. It's generally to veterans. Here's kind of the preference that they have. Veteran shall include a veteran, spouse, surviving spouse, dependent parent, child of a veteran. And there has to be some type of verification of a person's veteran status. And they assign points, which is consistent with the HUD occupancy handbook, 3 points for someone being a veteran. New York has a veteran's preference. It has it, really, it's in their New York private housing fair housing law, private fair housing finance law, right, allows preferences to be given to all veterans or their surviving spouses who served in active duty in a time of war. Want that preference to be implemented immediately. And you can see, get priority before applicants who do not qualify or do not hold that type of a preference. So New York has no problem with that policy as well. Again, there's a number of examples of ones that can be adopted. What I liked this was the EEOC Veterans Guidance. It lists specific steps employers can take to recruit and hire veterans with disabilities. But I looked at that, I realized, wow, that jumped off the page in terms of kind of affirmative housing marketing efforts that could be used to attract veterans. So I just kind of modified it a bit to fit housing. So example would be stating on an advertisement or vacancy announcement that is an equal housing opportunity provider and that individuals with disabilities, including disabled veterans or veterans with service-connected disabilities, are encouraged to apply. Making written recruiting materials such as application forms, brochures available in alternative formats, braille, large print, etc., or assisting veterans with disabilities in completing application materials when necessary. Again, sending vacancy announcements, asking referrals to government community groups that train or support veterans, posting advertisements and vacancy announcements and publications for veterans, and surveying other housing providers to learn about their successful outreach. All of these are good, needed, beneficial steps to make sure that we are meeting the unique housing needs of our veteran community, particularly the veterans with disabilities. So what are quick answers? Is military or veteran status protected class under fair housing laws? No, they're not a protected class category. Some states have added military veteran status, most have not. Again, are there other laws that can help veterans? Well, there's no federal protection specifically based on military or veteran status and housing. Veterans with disability are covered under the Fair Housing Act, the disability provisions of the Fair Housing Act, Section 504, and the ADA. There's also state, local civil rights laws that protect persons with disabilities. I hope years to come have a different answer to this, and military status, right? Veteran status will be protected. Can landlords and property owners of private housing give preference applications of veterans or homeless veterans? I'll give a yes to this one. They can give preference. The policy, however, must be adopted without any discriminatory intent. And the fact that it could be challenged as sex discrimination or race discrimination seems very, very questionable. What are the reasons? Because veteran population is increasingly diverse, hard to argue that it is focused, for example, as a pro-white policy or pro-male policy when there's significant proportions of women and minorities that are veteran status, and that is increasing. Plus, the number of veterans with disability has increased as well. So it'd be very, very tough to do it. And the real thing to really emphasize here is to make sure it's not a only veteran only building or facility. No, you have preference, but you're still renting, encouraging others to apply and be occupants of the facility. And that will be, put you on a strong base. It's a categorical denial that really gets into problems. So that should be okay. It's even a more solid answer when it comes to public housing agencies and public assistance program. They can give preference to applications with veterans. It's in the HUD regulation, HUD Public Housing Occupancy Handbook, their Home Investment Partnership Program regulations, and HUD's Public PAH policy, the guidance on housing individuals, on families experiencing homelessness, gives the right to give preference to homeless veterans. So they're pretty strong grounds when it comes to public housing agencies. It's almost on the flip side, almost like if a PHA does not have a policy, veterans preference policy, they could be questioned as to whether they're really seeking to comply and meet the needs of our veteran population. Any examples of policies and practices to reach veterans? Yeah, many available online. I showed ones from the state of New York and Boston. There's also the EEOC policy, which talked about affirmative employment outreach to facilitate the hiring of veterans. and those can be really adopted in a housing standpoint to encourage veterans to apply.